Hello, class. Welcome to this first installment of a three-part lecture, Oedipus and Philosophy, from Thebes to Colonus and beyond. This will be part 1, Oedipus and the Sphinx. By the end of this series, we should have a pretty good idea, not just of Sophocles' play, Oedipus Tyrannos, as well as Oedipus at Colonus, but of the peculiar status this play has come to have in both the ancient and the modern histories of philosophy. We'll see how the encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx comes to signify the threshold or liminal experience as such. And in this way, studying the ancient figure of Oedipus in Greek tragedy can be an interesting test case for exploring various kinds of thresholds: the aesthetic threshold of drama versus religion, the thresholds of religion and art, and the thresholds of philosophy and literature. Above all, during this three-part series, we'll be focusing on a close reading of French philosopher Jean-Joseph Goux in his book in English translation, Oedipus Philosopher, as well as Almut-Barbara Renger's chapters on Sophocles in her book Oedipus and the Sphinx. Along the way, we'll thoroughly explore Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, his views of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and his account of the history of Greek literature and tragedy in particular, from Sophocles to Euripides. And along the way, we'll also have cause to engage Simon Critchley's recent new book, Tragedy, the Greeks and Us, which we'll cover more extensively in the Antigone and Philosophy series to follow, as well as Hölderlin's translations and notes on Sophocles' plays, as well as Martin Heidegger's philosophy of Greek tragedy and his sporadic accounts of the figures of Oedipus and Antigone in their relevance for the history of poetry and philosophy. As with everything to do with Greek tragedy, one translation is never quite enough. This course has assigned Sophocles I, edited by David Green and Richard Lattimore, for its readability and contemporary form of expression. But unfortunately, this edition lacks sufficient introductions and editorial notes. The Penguin Classics edition, translation by Robert Fagel, is highly recommended for its extensive introductions and editorial notes by Bernard Knox. I'll be covering quite a bit of his explanatory material here. Also highly recommended are Friedrich Hölderlin's translations for the beauty of their language. It used to be you could only get David Constantine's translations of Hölderlin's German version of Sophocles in this edition here, but now that's impossible to find, so if you want to read along with Hölderlin's translations, I recommend this more recent edition. Since we're experimenting this semester with the literature and film component, these are the 3 films you'll be able to find in Canvas to watch over the next 3 weeks. It's odd that there doesn't seem to be a film version proper yet of Oedipus at Colonus, and I hope this is rectified soon, just the BBC Theatre version. Other than Jean Cocteau's Infernal Machine, there also seems to be a dearth of modern adaptations of Oedipus Tyrannos and Oedipus at Colonus, much unlike the situation with Sophocles' Antigone play, which we'll be turning to in week 5. So let's begin by introducing Sophocles, Aristotle and the function of tragedy, and the ancient Greek theatre, as well as the background Bronze Age myths concerning Oedipus, before turning to our critical question: why philosophy? How is philosophy relevant in understanding this material? So Sophocles was born about 495 BCE. He was a generation younger than Aeschylus, sometimes called the father of tragedy, and half a generation older than Euripides, sometimes thought as the last great tragedian of the classical age, although all 3 of these canonical writers of tragedy were more or less contemporary. Sophocles was the premier competitive tragedian of his time, and he was also a prominent politician. It's said he never won less than the second prize, and his prestigious first prizes are said to number over 18. So what is Greek tragedy? On the face of it, Greek tragedy is an art form dedicated to the god Dionysus, a god of the vine and of wine, a raving god, savage and elemental, a god of death and of the dead, and a lord of souls, a god of women and the father of tragedy, and of miracles and of the spirit, a god of spring, to whom the ivy, pine, and fig trees are dear, as we hear in Walter Friedrich Otto. It's often thought that tragedy has an obscure origin in Dionysiac ritual and festival, but this is much debated by scholars. We'll be exploring these issues extensively over the course of these 3 lectures. Certainly, tragedy is the premier art form by the time of the classical age in Athens, although it is by no means a strictly literary art form, as we might be lulled into believing simply because we're reading it in a literary form. Rather, the performance of tragedy involved decorations, costumes, the mask, a festival, all sorts of dramatic paraphernalia, music, dance, and sophisticated special effects. When ancient tragic drama was reinvented in the West, first via opera in the Renaissance and Monteverdi's Orfeo, all the way to Wagner's Ring Cycle, it was rightly understood as a reinvention of the total work of art that ancient Greek tragedy was. for a really interesting and concise overview of the theater of Dionysus as the location in which classical Athenian tragedies were staged, you can check out Edith Hall's excellent lecture, Theater of Dionysus, on YouTube. Alas, among the 120 plays Sophocles is said to have written, only 7 have come down to us intact. These are Ajax, Women of Trachis, Electra, Philoctetes, and luckily the 3 plays of a Theban saga. Scattered fragments from lost works and anecdotes about Sophocles have survived, and they're very often useful in interpreting his texts. The survival of a trilogy here, at least thematically, is fortunate, but Sophocles didn't intend the work as a trilogy. Greek tragedies were often staged in a sequence of 3, followed by a satyr play during one day of the city of Dionysia. That is not the case here, since the order of composition is agreed by scholars to be first Antigone, then Oedipus Rex, and then Oedipus and Colonus. In fact, these plays encompass almost 40 years of Sophocles' creative career. Sophocles died at the age of 90 or 91 in the winter of 406 to 5 BC, and he had seen within his lifetime plagues, the Greek triumph in the Persian War, and the bloodletting of the Peloponnesian War. War is a constant theme and background in his dramas, and he was still composing Oedipus and Colonus at the time of his death. As with most great figures of literature and philosophy, apocryphal death stories abounded. Some say he died holding his breath while writing, others that he died choking on a grape at a wine festival, and yet others that he died of happiness after winning the city Dionysia one last time. A few months after his death, a comic poet in a play titled The Muses wrote this significant in the light of his Oedipus character eulogy. Quote, "Blessed is Sophocles, who had a long life, was a man both happy and talented, and the writer of many good tragedies. He ended his life well, without suffering any misfortune." It's thought that Sophocles' first production in the annual tragedy competition at Athens was in 468 BCE, and that his last play was Oedipus and Colonus. Ancient critics often disagree as to whether it was Aeschylus or Sophocles who first employed a third speaking actor. Earlier, the rule had been that only 2 were allowed. Aristotle says that Sophocles was the first and that he also introduced scene painting. Of all Sophocles' tragedies in particular, and of all Greek tragedies in general, Aristotle in his Poetics considered Oedipus Rex the pinnacle of Greek tragedy, the very prototype of the genre, the fulfillment of tragedy's very nature. Indeed, Aristotle's Poetics was the first foundational treatise of the philosophy of literature or literary theory, at least if we discount Plato's Ion and Cratylus. The mythic material of the Theban saga was subject to numerous reinventions in Greek tragedy. We know that Aeschylus wrote a tetralogy of the Theban saga, and we know his satyr's play was called the Sphinx, thought to be the most Dionysian moment in a tragedy. Gilbert Murray remarks that it would be interesting to know how Dionysus and his troupe, or Theosos, were brought into connection with the Sphinx and Oedipus, and whether there was any appearance of the god Dionysus as a deliverer or bringer of new life. We don't have any of the satyr plays of Sophocles, but we do have fragments from the Ocorynchus papyrus of a Sophocles satyr play called the Trackers. Without doubt, both in antiquity and in the modern world, alongside Shakespeare, critics and commentators have agreed that Sophocles' plays, and these plays in particular, represent the culmination of the genre of tragedy in its capacity to represent human experience and heroic suffering. What was the purpose or function of tragedy, of the art form that is Greek tragedy? This we hear about in tantalizingly brief detail in Aristotle's Poetics, which gives us the first theory of literary genre, as well as suggestive insights which would come to be fundamental for aesthetic theory. Indeed, a large portion of the Poetics analyzes the different genres of poetry, with Aristotle reserving most of his attention for tragedy. He tells us that by far the most important element of a tragedy is its plot. The word Aristotle actually used here was mythos, which means myth or story. What is tragedy? According to Aristotle, it's an imitation, not of men, but of action and of life, of happiness and misfortune. Mythos or plot is the arrangement of a tragedy's events to achieve the end which tragedy has in view. That is tragedy's function, which Aristotle defines, alas, all too briefly as a catharsis of harmful emotions, those of pity and fear. The complex mythoi or plots of a tragedy also invariably revolve around 3 major plot features. 1, a reversal in fortune, called peripeteia, usually immediately followed by a recognition, a change from ignorance to knowledge, anagnoresis. These 2 events are most prototypically displayed in Oedipus's discovery at the end of the play that he's killed his father, married his mother, and then he plucks out his own eyes, which also instantiates here the suffering or pathos of a destructive or painful action In this case, a tragic self-wounding brought about as a result of hamartia, or the tragic flaw, usually clarified as hubris or overweening pride. This is just the broadest schematic outline of some of the influential ideas in Aristotle's Poetics, but we'll be exploring them in more detail later. When you're reading Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, it can be helpful to have Aristotle's Poetics in mind on plot as a unity of action. Greek tragedies are often structured rhythmically in this way, from a beginning, incentive moment, through complication, rising action, up to a climax, crisis, reversal, or peripeteia, followed by the lusus, or unraveling, leading to a denouement and falling action, and a final resolution. As to how the plays were originally staged, you can in fact stand today where these plays were performed on the Acropolis in Athens, in the ancient theater of Dionysus. The city Dionysia was not only a literary and musical event, but a religious and political ceremony. The audience was likely drinking, smoke and fumes from meat and cooking were everywhere, and the plays went on all day, much as we might binge-watch TV. Performers wore a mask, and only men were performers. Depending on era, women might have been in the audience, but not many, and we don't know this for sure. Many scholars believe that at most, certain high priestesses were allowed to attend tragedies, and we know the competition for seating was fierce, which would tend to argue against male citizens, allowing their precious seat to be given to women. The chorus is arguably the most important element in a Greek tragedy, for the chorus is the band of narrators, singers, or dancers who were thought to be originally the revelers from which the actors were chosen by Dionysiac inspiration. More on the Dionysiac origins theory of tragedy later. In the classical Athenian tragedies we have, the chorus invariably breaks up the action into scenes, which eventually gives us the practice of acts in a drama, although we don't have acts explicitly named in our editions of Greek tragedy. We know that the production was over the top, utilizing every kind of effect, most famously a crane or mechane, to produce a kind of deus ex machina, or revelation of God from the machine. In fact, we know an enormous amount about the social context for the production of Greek tragedies. The theater was paid for by the city taxes, and the administration of it was the collective responsibility of citizens. The Greek theater was semicircular rather than fully circular like a Roman auditorium, and estimates for seating capacity range from 4,000 to 6,000 to 14,000 to 17,000. In all the surviving Greek theaters we can see that the Greeks built their theaters in order to dramatically highlight the natural landscapes which the audience would have viewed, alongside the action, and there was behind the orchestra a skene or building that opened onto the stage, which was probably used for set, actor, and costume changes. As to Sophocles' own mythic and literary sources, for his Oedipus and Antigone plays in particular, scholars assume he had read the Thebaid and the Oedipia, which are 6th to 5th century epics, now lost except in a few fragments. This is really too bad, as it would be greatly illuminating of the treatment of Theban myth in Greek tragedy if these epics had survived. There is, however, mention of Oedipus and his family in Hesiod's Works and Days, in Homer's Iliad, above all in the Nicaea episode of the Odyssey. Sophocles was no doubt also exposed to folk traditions concerning the Oedipus mythology. The Greeks, though the imperial power in the region in the time of classical Athens, were fascinated by ancestral and mythic precursors and in the mythology and lore of other city-states around Greece, such as Thebes. While most of this material is Hellenic, broadly speaking, it also has an element of foreignness or exotic mystique. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides culled various stories from the old Theban narrative tradition, inheriting a picture of Oedipus as a ruler, defending his polis against enemy forces, and turning him into a tragic hero par excellence. From Aeschylus' Theban tetralogy, only the 7 Against Thebes has survived, and Euripides' versions are also lost. So let's turn a bit now to the Theban myth itself, and the ancestral stories that constituted the founding of the city of Thebes. It's easily forgotten, but quite relevant in Greek mythology, that Oedipus is a late descendant of the house of Cadmus. According to this tale, Europa, from which Europe gets its name, was the sister of Cadmus, who was abducted by Zeus in the form of a bull, and taken to Crete, where she became by Zeus the mother of Minos, the ancient Cretan king. Cadmus went to Greece from Asia Minor, Thrace or Phoenicia, leading to much speculation about Cadmus's Semitic roots, in search of his sister. The oracle of Apollo at Delphi told him not to go on with the search, but instead to follow a certain cow until she lay down, for there he was to found a city. The cow led Cadmus from Phocis to the place in Boeotia where he founded Cadmea, later called Thebes. And the more we know about this mythological backdrop and other Greek myths, the better position we're in to understand their utilization and transformation in Greek tragedy. The lineage of great kings and rulers after Cadmus in the land of Thebes goes like this. After Cadmus, Pentheus inherits the throne. This is the same Pentheus we'll see who figures prominently in Euripides' Bacchae, precisely in his struggle with the god Dionysus. The third great ruler is Labdacus, and the house of Oedipus, Oedipus's family legacy, is often called the Labdacids, followed by Lycus, Zethus, and Amphion, Laius, Oedipus's father, Oedipus, and then his son Eteocles, followed by the brief reign of Creon. Oedipus's own mythic narrative, in very broad outline, goes a little as follows. King Laius ordered a shepherd to expose his infant son on Mount Cithaeron. Hearing an oracle from Apollo that his son was destined to murder and supplant him, the baby was instead given by the shepherd to a Corinthian shepherd, a servant of Polybus, who was the king of Corinth, another city in the region, and Queen Merope, and they called the baby Oedipus from his swollen feet. As a young man, Oedipus was taunted at a drinking party for not really being the son of Polybus, and so he left Corinth to ask the oracle at Delphi who his parents really were. He did not get a direct answer to his question, but was warned that he was destined to kill his father and to marry his mother. Oedipus therefore did not return to Corinth, and at a crossroads that led to Thebes, he killed a regal old man in a chariot who had struck him and driven him off the road. Great example of road rage. The old man, who he did not recognize, was his father, Laius. After murdering Laius, Oedipus arrives in Thebes to find that an enigmatic, monstrous riddle creature, the Sphinx, has been terrorizing the town with plagues and killing its youth. Part woman, part lion, or part bird, and sometimes part serpent, the Sphinx was in the habit of posing riddles to young men, and then tearing them to pieces if they did not answer correctly. In this case, her riddle is variously recorded. What has one name that is 4-footed, 2-footed, and then 3-footed? From later sources, we can more completely reconstruct the Sphinx's riddle. There is a creature on earth which has 2 and 4 feet, a voice, and 3 feet, and of all creatures that live on earth, in the air, and in the sea, it alone can change its nature, but the strength of its limbs is at its lowest, precisely when it supports itself on the greatest number of feet. The answer to the question of which creature has a voice and walks on 4, 2, and 3 feet, Oedipus proclaims as man, Anthropos, who as a baby crawls on all 4s, in his prime walks on 2 feet, and in old age uses a stick as a 3rd foot. At this, the Sphinx is said to have hurled herself to her death, Oedipus becoming the savior of Thebes from the Sphinx and its plagues, and then becoming king in place of the dead Laius when he takes the widowed queen, Jocasta, as his wife. But is Oedipus really so clever, and the Sphinx so easily defeated? We'll find out soon enough. In any case, after solving the riddle of the Sphinx and living for a great number of years in happiness in Thebes with Jocasta and his 4 children, Antigone, Ismene, Polynices, and Eteocles, Thebes again becomes afflicted with a plague. The oracle at Delphi advises the Thebans that the plague has been caused by a pollution, and it does not exactly specify that it is the murderer of Laius living in the city who is the taint, rather that whatever the taint is, it must be driven out. This detail will be important later. Interpreting the oracle of Apollo as tasking him to seek out the murderer of Laius, Oedipus next, in the opening scenes of the drama, refuses to believe the prophet Tiresias, who tells him that he is the murderer and the source of pollution. A messenger, who was the same shepherd to whom the infant Oedipus had been given, comes from Corinth to announce the death of Polybus and offer the throne of Corinth to Oedipus. He tells Oedipus, who refuses to return to Corinth because of the prophecy that he would marry his mother, that he is not the son of Polybus. Oedipus sends for the other witness, the Theban shepherd, and the truth is finally discovered. At this point, Jocasta has already gone silently into the palace and hung herself, and Oedipus follows suit, finding her body and blinding himself with the brooches of Jocasta's robes, after which he is exiled. His story does not end here, however, for after Creon, the brother of Jocasta, becomes king, Oedipus in exile wanders alone for a time and then accompanied by his daughter Antigone and sometimes Ismene. After long years of wandering, he eventually arrives at Colonus in Attica and is kindly received by Theseus, the king of Athens. At Colonus, Oedipus bids farewell to his daughters and then miraculously disappears from the earth, observed only by Theseus. A hero cult is then established at the place where he vanished. Looking at the overall plot of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos, we can look again at its unity of action. The incentive moment is the plague and promise of Oedipus to again save the city. The oracle announces how this is to be done, although it does seem to be more Creon and Oedipus' surmise that it is the murderer of Laius who must be found. Oedipus puts a curse on the murder of Laius. Tiresias accuses Oedipus. Oedipus and Creon quarrel. Jocasta tells the story of the murder of Laius, and the mentions of the crossroads makes Oedipus suspicious, so they send for the herdsman or messenger. The messenger arrives from Corinth to declare that Polybus is not the father of Oedipus, beginning the moment of peripeteia. This leads to the climax, which is the story of the Theban herdsman and the moment of recognition, anagnoresis, followed by the denouement, the reporting of Jocasta's suicide and Oedipus' self-blinding, unraveling towards catastrophe, which is followed by scenes of the suffering of Oedipus with Creon and his children, at which Oedipus requests exile, the final resolution being his departure, which ends the plague. That being a very schematic outline of Oedipus's mythos, we can see how it was widely re-envisioned, often from differing sources. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides all composed plays that donned the Bronze Age mythic material, and later authors such as the Roman Seneca follow suit. By Byzantine times, Sophocles' plays were frequently copied out, so that almost 200 manuscripts exist, most of them virtual duplicates of each other, so we're pretty sure we have an accurate text in Greek here. And ever since the Renaissance, versions by Corneille, Dryden, and Voltaire, and more recently Stravinsky-Cocteau, as well as André Gide and Pasolini, constitute only a few of the most conspicuous examples out of hundreds of productions and adaptations. The myths of Oedipus have also had a profound impact on intellectual history, the most influential reworking of this material being the so-called Oedipus complex in Freudian psychoanalysis, as well as the scapegoat theory of Oedipus's tragic demise in Sir James Frazer, and lastly the pessimistic interpretation of Nietzsche, wherein Oedipus represents the tragic wisdom of the Greeks, that life is suffering and it's better never to have been born or to end life soon. On a most general level, Oedipus functions in our intellectual and cultural history as a metaphor for every human being's quest for personal identity and self-knowledge. In a world full of ignorance and hidden horrors, perhaps even a world ruled by divine indifference or malevolent fate. As Knox puts it, if there is one work most typically regarded as reflecting the Greeks' fatalistic or pessimistic outlook on life and the world, this is probably it. So that being the boring introductory stuff, let's pivot now to some important philosophical interpretations of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, starting with Peter Szondi in his short book An Essay on the Tragic. Szondi points out how the tragic weaves its way through the plot of Oedipus Rex as through no other work. At every point in the hero's fate, he is met with the unity of salvation and annihilation, a fundamental trait of everything tragic. It is not the annihilation that is tragic, but the fact that salvation becomes annihilation. The tragic does not take place in the hero's downfall, but rather in the fact that man meets his demise along the very path he took up to escape this demise. Such is the tragic hero's fundamental experience. It is confirmed with each of his steps, and at best only ultimately gives way to another experience, that the road to ruin ends in salvation and redemption. As Oedipus himself says, "I'll do everything, yet it is God who brings us salvation and ruin, and whether we prosper or remain in sorrow." Szondi points out, like Hermelin and others who will be studying later, how it is the three Delphic oracles of Apollo in Oedipus Rex that most determine the action. The first oracle is the one to Laius, re his son Oedipus. The second oracle is the one Oedipus himself discovers before the action begins, on his road from Corinth to Thebes. And the third oracle is the one which the messenger and Creon discuss, re the fate of Thebes. The entire plot is constructed around these three oracles and Oedipus's cry, "Oh, oh," the whole thing is coming out clearly, which summarizes all three oracles at the end of the drama and forms Oedipus's fate around them. Oedipus's father Laius's situation is tragic, since he acts as if his son might kill him, not knowing that his son will kill him, and so exposes his son. He ends up being killed by Oedipus when going to the oracle to determine if the son is really dead. Oedipus's situation is tragic, since having gone to the oracle to determine if the rumor about his being an illegitimate son of Polybus and Merope of Corinth is true, and is told about his tragic fate, by which he tries to avert catastrophe by heading to Thebes, killing his own father on the way. The third oracle, in the action of the play itself, intensifies the tragic situation. Now the gods command to Creon, as emissary of Oedipus, is to root out the pollution in Thebes and find the murderer of Laius. This promises salvation for Thebes, but annihilation for Oedipus, who becomes his own prosecutor and executioner. Most assuredly, the basic theme of Oedipus Tyrannus is human blindness and divine revelation. As Szondi notes, in retrospect, the first two oracles prove to be prefigurations of the decisive third oracle. Both Laius and the young Oedipus take up the tragic path between Thebes and Delphi, between human blindness and divine revelation. Oedipus follows this road to avoid becoming a murderer, and Laius to avoid being murdered, and yet the road leads the one to death and the other to murder. Oedipus Rex thus dramatizes the, quote, path of knowledge as the road between Thebes and Delphi, which turns inward. Disaster awaits the king not as a stranger at the end of the road, but at the destination of his own knowledge. Oedipus, searching for salvation, finds annihilation, but after many years, again a measure of salvation in Oedipus at Colonus. The tragic flaw, or hamartia, of this character has ever been understood as the hubris of knowledge. Oedipus is one led astray by his own cleverness. According to Renger, the Oedipus that Sophocles stages is a man who relies one-sidedly on his intelligence. This over-reliance, in the sense of the Aristotelian theory of tragedy, his hamartia, or tragic flaw, or better, his misaim, that which he lacks in the pursuit of something, in this case the true intelligence of the gods. Oedipus relies on an intelligence that leads him into a catastrophe, from the Greek katastrophe, as a turning towards demise. A catastrophe in which his identity as a man whose intelligence makes him unconquerable breaks down. For Renger, the play is less about guilt versus innocence, ignobility versus nobility, or the powerlessness of humanity versus the omnipotence of the gods, than it is about tragic destiny itself as ineluctable and unavoidable. The final verdict of the chorus on Oedipus is, quote, "Residents of our native Thebes, behold, this is Oedipus, who knew the renowned riddle and was a most mighty man. What citizen did not gaze down on his fortune with envy? See into what stormy sea of troubles he has come. So long as our eyes wait to see the final destined day, we must call no mortal happy until he has crossed life's border free from pain." While there is some intimation that Oedipus was understood in relationship to philosophy, perhaps even as a philosopher in Sophocles' Athens, we'll explore this evidence later, the tradition of thinking about the tragic destiny of Oedipus as the tragic destiny of philosophy and the philosopher, although it is intimated in Hellenistic and Roman antiquity and in the Renaissance, didn't really come into its own and get started as a fundamental philosophy of tragedy until the era of German idealism. This initiates the tradition, or canon within a canon as it's often called, of the German philosophy of the tragic, with Oedipus on center stage. And it is the young Friedrich Schelling, in his letters on dogmatism and criticism and early lectures on the philosophy of art, who most crystallizes from Greek tragedy a speculative philosophy and a new understanding of the Greek tragic worldview. Although he'll take some issue with Aristotle's Poetics, Schelling begins by agreeing with Aristotle that Oedipus is the most tragic figure we inherit from the Greek stage. Oedipus's fate is the highest possible misfortune, that is, by fate, to become guilty without genuine guilt. It is thus necessary that this guilt itself be necessity, and that it will be contracted not through error, as Aristotle says, but through the will of destiny and an unavoidable fate, or by the vengeance of the gods. Such is the nature of Oedipus's guilt. Schelling goes on to succinctly review the plot of Oedipus Tyrannus, much as does Szondi. It is the three oracles that most generate Oedipus's unfortunate fate and his guilt without genuine guilt. Schelling thus sums up Oedipus, quote, "A mortal preordained by fate for guilt and transgression, but struggling against fate and fleeing that guilt, nonetheless is frightfully punished for a transgression that was actually a work of fate." And he asks, as many others have done, are these contradictions not simply devastating? And where is that foundation of beauty the Greeks nonetheless did achieve in their tragedies? Returning to Aristotle's Poetics, Schelling points out the peculiar configuration, the contradiction of fortune and misfortune in the life of Oedipus. His fortune becomes his misfortune, and his misfortune his eventual salvation. In the Poetics, Aristotle presents the following cases of changes of fortune. Peripeteia. 1. A just person falls from a state of fortune into one of misfortune. Aristotle remarks correctly here that this is neither terrible nor pitiable, but rather only horrible, and for that reason unsuitable as a subject matter for tragedy. Tragedies properly understood are not simply about bad things befalling good people. This is simply horrible, but not tragic. Another example of change of fortune is when an unjust person moves from unfortunate to fortunate circumstances. This is also far from tragic, but merely arouses our moral indignation. The third possibility of change of fortune is when a highly unjust and wicked person is removed from fortunate circumstances into misfortune. This fits our moral intuition of justice, and indeed even our love of man, but it can evoke neither sympathy nor fright. And so Schelling goes on with Aristotle to try to figure out what makes the contradiction of fortune and misfortune in Oedipus so distinctive. The only possibility remaining is thus a case of mediating between these. The subject of tragedy, in this case Oedipus, is a person who is exceptional as regards neither virtue nor justice, and who does not fall into misfortune as a result of wickedness or crime, but rather as a result of error. Schelling thus continues with Aristotle before critiquing him. The person to whom this happens is one who earlier stood in fortunate circumstances and was held in high esteem, such as Oedipus. For Schelling again, error is insufficient to characterize Oedipus's outcome as the most tragic. Rather, it is the will of destiny, of the oracles themselves, and so the vengeance of the gods that makes Oedipus guilty without really being guilty. It is tragic fate itself that annihilates him. His error, as Renger points out, is precisely rooted in his human capacity for insight. What is so fascinating about the frame of Sophocles' drama, at least for its audience, is that all the facts and narrative turns are known fully in advance. What is being worked out from the start to the finish is not the details of the plot, but their meaning. The whole thing is a voyage of questions and answers, of explorations and discoveries. The two storylines, the search for Laius' murder and the search for Oedipus's own parentage, ultimately come together in Oedipus's single, terrible recognition of his parricide and incest, and the protagonist's slow process of feeling his way towards truth, disclosure, and self-induced blindness is thereby performed. Sophocles' decision to steer attention to Oedipus's discovery of the truth, a discovery that the hero makes only through persistent, independent searching, is also a reflection of the Athenian spirit of the time, that is the time of the sophists and soon of classical philosophy after Socrates. And it may be that Sophocles is here acting as a critic of the new philosophy, the Athenian Enlightenment. Quote from Renger, in the 5th century BCE, the city-state of Athens emerged in the midst of an exceedingly active intellectual life that was coursing through the Greek-speaking realm. Sophocles was every bit as aware of its advantages as he was of its disadvantages and dangers that in turning against traditional religion, the wisdom of Tiresias, could reach into the abyss of human existence. Renger goes on this theme, which we'll also find in Jean-Joseph Goux' reading. Sophocles' intention in writing the Oedipus may have been a riposte to what he perceived as the impious character of the Athenian philosophical Enlightenment. The play appeared in 430 at the height of the Greek Enlightenment movement, promulgated by Sophism and its governing motto, knowledge is power. At this time, a general euphoria of understanding predominated, which posited, as the sophist Protagoras proclaimed, that man is the measure of things. Sophocles, himself a man of intelligence, assumed a critical position towards this worldview insofar as he regarded it as one-sided. For him, unyieldingly one-sided attitudes towards life were fundamentally disharmonic, and he saw in them the gravest danger of hubris. It is this gravest danger of hubris that is stunningly on stage in the very first lines and opening speech of Oedipus Rex, where Oedipus emerges from the palace door to a plague-ridden Thebes and announces himself as a savior, as he was once upon a time of yore in the era of the Sphinx. In the translation assigned, "Children, young sons and daughters of old Cadmus, why do you sit here with your suppliant crowns? The town is heavy with a mingled burden of sounds and smells, of groans, of hymns and incense. I do not think it fit that I should hear of this from messengers, but came myself, I, Oedipus, whom all men call the great. You're old and they are young, come and speak for them. What do you fear or want, that you sit here suppliant? Indeed, I'm willing to give you all you may need. I would be very hard should I not pity suppliants like these." Or in Constantine's version of the yet more powerful Hermeleutic translation, I have come myself with fame by all called Oedipus. According to Renger, in interpreting this opening, we see clearly that the hero in his sovereign position is exposed to this danger, to hubris, to an especially high degree. Here, a priest who leads an emergency Theban delegation portrays for Oedipus the great need that has come upon the city as a result of the plague and beseeches him, the first among men, for help, he who has already saved the city once before, by freeing it from the Sphinx's terror. Oedipus appears in this scene as one endowed with a thoroughly superior ability and understanding. He already knows everything the priest is saying, even before hearing it. The opening scene's reference to Oedipus's great rescue mission, as well as his intellectual prowess, are alluded to and taken up implicitly and explicitly throughout the rest of the play. For example, by the Theban seer Tiresias and by the choir of Theban elders, who praise their king as having passed the Sphinx's test, cleverly, with wisdom, Sophos, and as a friend of the city. It is Oedipus who declares with his ego, I, Oedipus, will be the one who will reveal, Greek phanai, what is hidden. That is, Oedipus will bring light into the darkness of things, clear up the issue, and illuminate it, phano, as he did once before by solving the Sphinx's riddle. Thus, without any hesitation, he sets himself up upon this enlightening endeavor. For Renger, Oedipus's belief in his ability to dispel the darkness of ignorance and his quick decision to act in the interests of the polis is typical of the Athenian attitudes of his time. But more problematic in the Sophoclean sense are the imbalance, disharmony, and one-sidedness apparent in Oedipus's thought and action. The hero sees his intelligence as a panacea or healing remedy that is insuperable. We could say he is beset almost unconsciously by the spirit of the depth, for he is driven by an insane, insuperable, effective drive to know, to seek out the truth at any cost. And as before, when he slew his father, he lets himself be led by strong emotions, which stand in the way of true insight and carry him away into misconduct which he might otherwise have avoided. That being our preliminary introduction to Sophocles and his times, to the mythic background and plot of Oedipus Tyrannos, as well as to a preliminary philosophical approach in Aristotle, in Schelling, in Peter Szondi, and in Renger, let's turn now to the promised close discussion of Jean-Joseph Goux in his book Oedipus Philosopher. Goux begins by asking, what if the logic of the Oedipus myth, not the Oedipus play yet, were subjected to analysis with the tools of anthropology, comparative mythology, and narratology? Might such an analysis modify or even invalidate the approach, the Oedipus complex, that Freud derived from his psychoanalytic experience? According to Goux, when Freud discovered first in himself, through self-analysis, and then in the dreams of his male patients, persistent fantasies of patricide and maternal incest, he was promptly reminded of the fate of King Oedipus, on which Sophocles based the most perfect tragedy of Greek theater. Goux assumes his audience is here familiar with Freud's interpretation, so doesn't quote it, but we can digress here for a moment to quote one of Freud's most famous statements on King Oedipus. His fate moves us only because it might have been our own, because the oracle laid upon us before our birth the very curse which rested upon him. It may be that we are all destined to direct our first sexual impulses towards our mothers and our first impulses of hatred and resistance towards our fathers. Our dreams convince us that this is so. King Oedipus, who slew his father Laius and wedded his mother Jocasta, is nothing more or less than a wish fulfillment, the fulfillment of the wish of our childhood. But we, more fortunate than he, insofar as we have not become psychoneurotics, have since our childhood succeeded in withdrawing our sexual impulses from our mothers and in forgetting the jealousy of our fathers. As the poet brings the guilt of Oedipus to light by his investigation, he forces us to become aware of our own inner selves, in which the same impulses are still extant, even though they are suppressed. Now, before we get our panties all tied up in a knot that Freud's psychosexual theory is resolutely, decisively not true, it doesn't apply to me, don't worry, Goux will be your ally in criticizing the reductivism inherent to Freud's interpretation of the Oedipus myth. On the other hand, it would be wrong to say that Freud's theory is simply false. While most adults don't remember very well the psychosexual stage of development that Freud describes here, Some do, and much of Freud's theory is fairly well borne out in childhood psychology, even if his totalizing conclusions have been questioned and mostly rejected. What exactly does Freud mean by saying that the Oedipus myth is nothing more than a wish fulfillment that has been repressed and disguised? This goes back to one of his early books, The Interpretation of Dreams, which shows how to protect sleep and relieve potential anxiety, the mind goes through a process of what he terms dream work, which consists of 3 primary mental activities. First, condensation of elements that are abbreviated or compressed. Next, displacement of elements that are changed, particularly in terms of illusion and a difference of emphasis. And third, in representation, which is the transmission of elements of daily life into imagery and symbolism, and which are many, varied, and often sexual. The child generally does have proto-sexual impulses which are directed in some way to either or both parents, as well as aggression or envy, and it is these elements of difficult-to-process emotion that are condensed, displaced, and represented in the dream work, leading to the fact that many children and adults do, or at some point have had, sexual dreams involving a parent. For Freud, something similar to this process can be discerned in the origin and evolution of myth, especially in the Oedipus myth, as told by the Greeks and immortalized by Sophocles. Myths such as the Oedipus myth are thus, in the Freudian interpretation, reflections of people's waking effort to systematize the incoherent visions and impulses of their sleep world. Here, speaking way too reductively of the indigenous mind, the imaginative world of children, savages, and neurotics are similar, and these patterns are revealed in the motifs and symbols of myth. Now, for all its problems, which we won't enumerate here, Freud's theory does work very well for many Greek myths. Another very clear place in Greek mythology for which Freud's theories worked very well is Hesiod's Theogony and its myth of succession, whereby father gods are endlessly worried on account of usurpation by younger gods, and attempt to swallow, destroy, or otherwise disinherit younger gods who end up growing up to overthrow their fathers anyway, often in scenes of brutal violence. Early Greek civilization, at least, was dominated by a patricidal impulse, as well as in the myth of Uranos and Gaia, where Uranos, the heaven, is the son of Gaia, the earth, by the motif of maternal incestuous desire. Uranos endlessly copulates with Gaia until his testicles are severed by his son Colonus in Gaia's womb. When it comes to Electra, for which we have some surviving tragedies, and who is often considered the feminine counterfigure to Oedipus, we have a parallel and related psychological configuration. Although this is not too clear from the surviving tragedies, Electra is animated by an excessive love of the father and hatred for the mother. That's about all we need from Freud to continue with our understanding of Goux' interpretation. So here's Goux' basic postulate about Oedipus. For Freud, the Oedipus complex, that is our repressed sexual desire for the mother or hatred of the father, is what explains the myth. And Freud did not therefore see the myth itself as a purveyor of knowledge that would be entitled as such to interrogate the psychoanalytic experience. Reduced to a provocative antithesis, Goux' own thesis is expressed as follows: it is the Oedipus myth that explains the complex, and not vice versa. In other words, it is because the West, that is European culture, usually defined as a fusion of Hellenic or Greek culture and Judaic becoming Christian culture, is fundamentally Oedipian. And it is because of this that Freud discovers the Oedipus complex. For Goux, accordingly, the logic of the Oedipus myth as myth can help us to clarify and perhaps even to subvert Freud's description of the Oedipus complex. And so we turn to Goux' 4 key theses on the Oedipus myth itself. Rather than being a standard myth, such as the monomyth of the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell, for example, for Goux, the myth of Oedipus is an anomaly. And this is because it is usually matricide and not patricide that is at the heart of the heroic myth in its typical and universal forms. The hero who is to become king is the hero who kills the female dragon, the female serpent, the female monstrosity in bloody combat. By murdering a dangerous, dark, and feminine force, the hero in turn liberates his bride. Compared to this widely attested prototype, which Goux calls the monomyth, the Oedipus story is an aberrant myth obtained by a disruption of the initial narrative form of heroic mythology. Goux is not promoting heroic mythology or the monomyth in either its matricidal or its patricidal form. He's not saying that Oedipus is a lesser hero in not slaying the female monster, serpent, dragon as a symbol of the mother, and is well aware of the intense misogyny inherent in these images. Goux' reading is not, for example, a patrifocal one, which would advise young men to take up the hero's journey in its traditional forms. This is not another version of Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning. Rather, Goux' interest is in the anomaly of the Oedipus myth as a marker by which we can discern the forms of Western subjectivity and philosophical subjectivity which follow. More on this soon. Goux' second thesis on the Oedipus myth is, I think, very helpful in understanding the religious dynamics at play in Sophocles' drama. The mythic anomaly or disruption we see in Oedipus's tale explains not only the mechanism of the myth's generation as a narrative, but also the feature that best defines it differentially. For Goux, the Oedipus myth is a myth of failed royal investiture, or of avoided masculine initiation, where this failure or avoidance is systematically and rigorously linked to the mythic anomaly of patricide and incest. What is more, in Goux' third thesis, the mechanism by which the trial of initiatory investiture is disrupted can be fully explained only within the framework of an archaic functional tripartition, that is, of the sacred, war, and fertility, which was first brought to light by the French linguist Georges Dumézil in Indo-European studies. We'll learn more about what this means in a minute. For now, we can note that the Oedipus myth is a transformation of the monomythic plot, and thus a systematic disruption of the canonical schema of the triple ordeal that is correlated with the hero's three sins. This is dense stuff, but just to explain it a bit preliminarily in a few images, we can notice that triplicity and triple symbolism is an extremely common feature of Greek heroic myth. In the myth of the hero Bellerophon on the horse Pegasus slaying the Chimera, we have a clear example of one triple monster versus another. Bellerophon is a man, here united symbolically with the horse Pegasus, who is also a bird. So we have man, horse, and bird. The Chimera, a relative of the Sphinx, is another triformal creature, a monster whose three parts are serpent, goat, and lion. We're used to reading these heroic myths of the hero slaying the monster in the most general terms, but we seldom ask what is the symbolic meaning of this monster and of this hero in their obviously triformal symbolic functions. Later heroic narrative will pick up triformal symbolism like this more inconsistently. In this image by the French symbolist painter Gustave Moreau of St. George slaying the dragon, we clearly see the triplicity of symbols in St. George himself, horse, St. George, and the halo, or function of the sacred. The monstrous anima image, however, is more one-sided, but is also connected to two other symbols in the canvas: the bride, which is released by St. George's act of slaying the dragon, as well as the kingdom. So where does all this triformal symbolism come from within our cultural heritage? Dumézil, the great French linguist, made many innovations in his study of Indo-European society and myth, but most famous is his trifunctional hypothesis, which shows how archaic Indo-European societies, that is, societies far predating major world civilizations, the Greeks, the Egyptians, even the Mesopotamians, can be understood through linguistic analysis in their descendant language families to be operating within a tripartite ideology. Archaic societies are basically composed in this model on three classes or castes. There are the priests, who fulfill the sacred function, the warriors, the martial function, and the commoners, the productive or economic function. The ruling function of sovereignty, that which governs over and directs a society through positive law, is itself understood as having two parts. One, a juridical, that is legal, priestly or natural sovereignty, which Dumézil famously finds in the Vedic god Mitra, and the other, a more powerful, unpredictable, or supernatural kind of sovereignty, not connected to priesthood so much as to the cult of the family and kingship. This Dumézil finds typified in the Vedic god Varuna. Now, not only are there many representations of functional sovereignty in the way it administers the three domains of the sacred, the martial, and the economic in the ancient world, but there are also many representations of monstrous sovereignty, of sovereignty gone terribly wrong. A priest who commits a sacrilege or otherwise falls out of the favor of the gods, or a king whose unpredictable nature leads him into tyranny and a disconnection with the priestly prerogative of living in harmony with the sacred. What Goux had just called the hero's three sins refers in later mythology like an echo or residue as a way of marking the three functional domains, and this is represented symbolically in triformal imagery and symbolism. Many Greek heroes in some way transgress or violate these three separate domains of the sacred, the martial, and the economic. And these transgressions are projected or manifested in myth, very often as the three parts of the encountered shadow monster. We'll go into detail on all these claims in a moment, but first, let's review Goux' fourth thesis regarding the Oedipus myth. It is not only a disruption of the traditional structures of initiation and the functional tripartition that governs the order in Indo-European societies, but it is also the very gesture that founds Greek reason. And here Goux turns to some perhaps overbroad speculative claims that it's going to take us a while to unpack. Again, in short, the posture of Oedipus breaks with, subverts or transgresses the functional tripartition and is an equivalent gesture to the founding of Greek reason, to what will eventually become the tribunal and subjective consciousness of the I think. In spite of or because of the misidentification of the radical essence of masculine desire, usually in heroic myth, to escape the world of the mothers and enter into the world of the fathers, this myth ambiguously expresses both the truth and the characteristic error of Western consciousness, as well as its metaphysical and anthropological distinctiveness. And so, in the big reach here that'll take Goux' entire book to fully explain, implicitly for Sophocles, but explicitly for Hegel, another German philosopher who alongside Schelling takes up the Oedipus myth, Oedipus eventually becomes the prototypical figure of the philosopher, as the one who challenges sacred enigmas in order to establish the perspective of man and the self. For Goux, this Oedipian configuration impresses upon all of philosophy, from its origins to the various overturnings of idealism. Freud's error, which has a grain of truth in his formulation of the Oedipus complex, is thus just one recognition of how the Oedipus myth informs and shapes our intellectual history. Goux goes so far as to claim that the Oedipian imaginary, desire for the mother and murder of the father, haunts the democratic subject and its characteristic forms of rationality. Indeed, even the separation between consciousness and the unconscious, first fully formulated in modern philosophy and psychology, is itself Oedipian. This claim in particular, Goux won't fully be able to justify until the end of his book. So having stated and very briefly outlined Goux' four theses regarding the Oedipus myth, let's go into each of them now in more detail as Goux develops them. First, via the core question, what is the relationship between the monomyth and the myth of Oedipus, which Goux answers through doing a little bit of comparative mythology with the myths of other Greek heroes, such as Perseus, Bellerophon, and Jason. The episodes in the life of these three more standard Greek heroes tends more or less entirely to cohere with each other. In all three of these myths, a king fears a younger man. A future hero escapes from a king's murderous intentions, and usually a second king or dispatcher king cannot bring himself to commit the crime of murdering the threatening hero, and so assigns the hero a perilous task in which the future hero is expected to lose his life. The trial invariably takes the form at some point of a fight with the monster, or several monsters. The hero succeeds in defeating the monster, not on his own, but with the help of a god or a wise man or a future bride. Finally, the hero's triumph over the monster allows him to marry the daughter of a king. Having so outlined the episodes of the monomyth, Goux next points to the similarities between the Oedipus myth and these three others. All four heroes are brought up under the protection of a foreign and less threatening king. All four heroes do confront a dangerous monster and they emerge victorious. Bellerophon defeats the Chimera, Oedipus the Sphinx, Jason the Colchis dragon, and all these monsters are mythically the children of the snake woman Echidna, except Medusa, who Perseus slays, who is a child of Phorcys and Ceto. Next similarity, each of the victories achieved over a monster leads the hero to marriage. Perseus marries Andromeda, Bellerophon marries Philonoe, Jason marries Medea, and Oedipus marries Jocasta. Also, in Hesiod's dizzying account of all the heroic exploits at the end of the Theogony, they are all structured by the motif of a wedding at the end. By defeating the monster and marrying a royal bride, all four heroes end up royally invested. Here you see various other depictions in Gustave Moreau of this scene of the monomyth. The hero and the monster are always locked in furious combat, quite unlike in the posture of Oedipus in these paintings by Ingres with respect to the Sphinx. Oedipus does not do physical, but rather only mental battle with the Sphinx. He lures the seductress in order to out-riddle the Riddler, and so begins Goux' explanation of the way in which the Oedipus myth is anomalous with respect to the monomyth. In all other Greek heroic myth, including those of Hercules, the hero cannot emerge victorious from the trial that has been imposed on him without the help of one or more gods. Perseus is assisted by Athena, who teaches him how to tell Medusa from the other two Gorgon sisters. The goddess with the blue-green eyes also gives him a polished shield, instructing him never to look directly at Medusa, but only at her reflection. And Hermes, for his part, arms Perseus with a sharp steel sickle. Similarly, when Bellerophon is preparing his attack on the Chimera, Athena brings him the golden bridle that will allow him to control the winged horse, Pegasus. Jason too is aided by Athena at the start of his long journey when she fits an oracular beam into the prow of the ship Argo. All these standard heroic myths reflect the fact that for the Greeks, to triumph without the help of the gods is an act of arrogance and madness. But this is precisely what Oedipus does. He achieves victory over the Sphinx all at once, without help, without preparatory steps. Furthermore, and perhaps even more importantly, he triumphs in a single word rather than a heroic action. Oedipus does not kill the Sphinx in an act of warrior's daring. The Sphinx kills herself. She commits suicide by flinging herself into the abyss as soon as the riddle is solved. Her self-destruction is an act of spite committed by a dishonored creature whose secret has been exposed. The Sphinx is not killed. She is offended by Oedipus's answer. In the words of the chorus, quote, "We saw him then, when the she-hawk swept against him, saw with our own eyes his skill, Sophos, his brilliant triumph. There was the test. He was the joy of Thebes." And Oedipus himself says to Tiresias, "When the Sphinx, that chanting fury, kept her death watch here, why silent then, not a word to set our people free? There was a riddle, not for some passerby to solve. It cried out for a prophet. Where were you? Did you rise to the crisis? Not a word. You and your birds, your gods, nothing. No, but I came by, Oedipus, the ignorant. I stopped the Sphinx, with no help from the birds, by the flight of my own intelligence. I hit the mark. The power of Oedipus's young intelligence is such that it wins out over and against the ancestral knowledge of the deciphering of signs. Neither human initiation or divine assistance has been necessary. Oedipus, the ignorant, has succeeded all by himself. And so Goux turns to summarizing the Oedipian anomalies. First, the motif of a legitimating trial imposed by a king is absent. In its stead is found the killing of a king, who is also the hero's father. Second, the dangerous confrontation with a female monster presents the following irregularities. No assistance from the gods. Neither Athena nor Hermes is present to help the hero. No assistance from mortals. Neither advice from a seer sage nor help from a future bride. No phasing of the trials that leads eventually to a decisive victory, and no mobilization of physical force, but the uttering of a single word. Lastly, the hero marries not the daughter of a king, but his own mother. Next, Goux turns to show how even the famously influential structuralist interpretation by Levi Strauss leaves out these important details. And it's true to some extent that the structuralist approach reduces the myth to a system of logical combinations and fails to take into account the affective dimension. In fact, the meaning of the Oedipus myth as a drama of failed or avoided initiation does not reside in the outcomes of a combinatorial process. For Goux, it refers to the affective constraints, to the polarizations of desire, to a dramaturgy of the passions. These are internal but objective and typical existential situations, or we might say with Van Gennep, rites of passage, such as birth, death, marriage, and battle. If the dramaturgical myth of Oedipus is all about a rite of passage that has gone somehow wrong, and if Freud did not quite take this into account in his formulation of the Oedipus complex, then it begs the question, was Freud wrong? According to Goux, Freud completely fails to see this basic structure of the Oedipus myth, this differential that gives it its full meaning. Oedipus's adventure is constituted by a lack, that is, a lack of the lethal act of slaying the female monster. In place of this lethal act, Oedipus uses his intelligence to divine the secrets of the Sphinx, and what emerges is the priority of man. Goux distinguishes the riddle of the Sphinx into two senses. The first is the riddle that the Sphinx herself proposes, but the other one is the riddle that the Sphinx herself constitutes and is. Freud's Oedipus complex is, in a way, an attempt to fathom this second mystery. What does the Sphinx really represent? But Goux asks, what if neither had found the answer? Goux next turns to another big claim that we can't fully unpack here. Monstricide is the great unthought element of Freudian doctrine. What does this mean? Well, in the famous Totem and Taboo, influenced by the anthropology of his day, especially Sir James Frazer, Freud imagines that the original nucleus of society revolved around the chieftain leader, the male sovereign who oversaw what he calls the primal horde, or primitive grouping of humanity. and who hoarded all the women to himself, while at the same time siring innumerable sons, whose fraternal bond for each other and hatred for their chieftain ruler eventually caused them to commit the great act of patricide, in turn promoting one among them to be chieftain, only to start the cycle all over again until the fraternal principle, or truly democratic society, was born, as a bulwark against the chaos of constant succession through patricide and war. In this image of archaic societies, it is patricide, not matricide, that is the key feature, but in point of fact, unbeknownst to Freud, in the Babylonian civilization which produced the Enuma Elish, we find a contradiction to this Freudian doxa. There, the original sea mother goddess, Tiamat, and her benevolent, if a little lame, husband consort, Apsu, at first benevolently rule over the other gods which are their issue. But the murder of her consort husband, Apsu, by the younger generation vying for rule and power, leads Tiamat to abruptly, in the text, transform into a raving monster, indeed, into the original mother of monsters. And the great war of the gods between the older and the younger generation begins, where it only comes to an end with the hero king, Marduk, slaying the mother goddess, that is, committing matricide, and dismembering her to form all the features of the inhabited geographical landscape, thereby eternally assuring the rule of the male heroic king in his function as matricide of the disturbing power of chaos, nature, and the feminine. If we read the Enuma Elish and earlier mythological texts, it is matricide and not patricide which is the key event in the emergence of Western patriarchal civilized order. For Goux, the schism that shook psychoanalysis at its very outset, that is, Freud's break with the heretic Carl Jung, is not unrelated to this issue. In his 7th chapter on Mind, Renger returns to Freud on the Sphinx and notes how he introduces an inscrutable unconscious, a creature within a creature, a secret self that happens to be an expert in siphonoul and sacrifice. Freud risked and rested his interpretation on the interpretation of dreams. Dreams, or we might add visions, tell a truth which cannot be told. A greater discovery followed. By one account, the greatest of his discoveries, the Oedipus complex, which was not rare or unusual, it is universal. You have the Oedipus complex, Hegel's sons had it, Freud and Moses had it. And Freud famously wrote, "The Greek legend seizes upon a compulsion which everyone recognizes because he senses its existence within himself." The universality of the Oedipus complex made Freud's work urgent everywhere, a dream come terribly true. Given all this and his own extensive collection of Sphinx iconography, it is puzzling that Freud scarcely mentions the Sphinx in the interpretation of dreams. Writing to Carl Jung in 1907, Freud went a bit further. The original Oedipus was himself a case of obsessional neurosis, the riddle of the Sphinx. Freud here identifying Oedipus with his Sphinx. And in 1911, shortly before their break, he writes again, "The Oedipus complex is at the root of religious feeling. Religion would thus be the obsessional neurosis of humanity. Like the obsessional neuroses of children, it arose out of the Oedipus complex, out of the relation to the father." For a more extensive treatment than Goux or Renger provide here, I recommend this book on the right, Freud and Oedipus, which could also be the basis of a paper. Of course, Jung had another idea about the Sphinx. For Jung, the Sphinx is a semi-theriomorphic representation of the mother imago, or rather of the terrible mother, much like in Goux's Jungian book. Claude Levi-Strauss calls her the phallic mother, kin to the Hopi mother of animals, who rapes young hunters. And here Jung concludes that the riddle is in fact a trap which the Sphinx laid for the unwary wanderer. Overestimating his intellect in a typically masculine way, Oedipus walked right into it, and all unknowingly committed the crime of incest. The riddle of the Sphinx was herself the terrible mother imago, which Oedipus would not take as a warning. For now, I want to push just a little against Goux's own reading. Goux mentions in the preface that writing this book, Oedipus Philosopher, was a perilous undertaking for him. Why? Because it concerned the essence of male desire and male subjectivity. It is unfortunate and makes this book just a little bit dated that Goux does not engage in any feminist readings of monstricide in the monomyth. His perspective seems basically Jungian or Campbellian in regards to the monomyth. And so Goux moves on to acknowledge his debt to Jung when he writes, "Jung was not mistaken to remain intransigent in his quarrel with Freud. No concept in Freudian doctrine can come to terms with this monster. And Jung, seeking the meaning of this dangerous creature, the Sphinx, was right to look to the mother, to the dark, enveloping, stifling mother who binds and captivates her son, holds him back, traps him in the numberless coils of her reptilian attachment. If we widen our lens outside of Greek culture and mythology, there's more to the story here, but by the time of the Greeks, this was the basic wisdom about monsters. They reflect the dark, reptilian, coiling dimensions and feminine dimensions of the earth or the chthonic, opposed to the illuminating patriarchal principle of Zeus, the Iranian gods and their light. In Freudian terms, the phallic mother is Echidna, the snake woman. Staying with Goux for the moment on this perilous path, through our understanding of the Oedipus myth in particular, Goux's next move is to oppose the concept of initiation in Greek society and myth to that of castration in Freudian doctrine. In the Oedipus myth, underlying Sophocles' play, we witness, according to Goux, avoided initiation and resultant symbolic death through self-disfigurement and exile. In contrast, in the Monomyth, we find a myth of initiation confronted and achieved. Psychoanalytically, at least, Oedipus's failed initiation maps onto the avoidance of castration in Freudian doctrine. Oedipus fails to confront his unconscious desire for the mother, and so ends up remaining in her sphere, defined by the Sphinx that he only symbolically vanquishes, and siring 4 children with his mother during his long reign in Thebes. Ritually or telestically, telestic being the Greek word here that we can translate in English as initiation, from telos, end or fulfillment, and in terms of Greek religious consciousness, Oedipus fails to undergo initiatory death and rebirth outside the world of the mother. He walks back into the world of a mother as into a trap, and believes he's earned his happiness based on his great wisdom in only symbolically defeating the Sphinx. What Oedipus fails to do more fundamentally, like the other heroes, is to undergo a rebirth into the world of the fathers. In the destiny of Oedipus, the telestic or initiatory process is thus interrupted. We're now moving into the third and final part of this lecture, a more in-depth analysis of the Sphinx herself. Now, before going into this chapter in more detail, a little aside on the background of my own hermeneutic situation here. Goux's book is by no means perfect. It's written with a signature excessive French erudition. It also lacks any hint of being up to date with feminist theory or interpretation of these materials in the 1990s when it was published. And lastly, it may be considered, and I imagine thinkers like Simon Critchley would consider it regressive, an excessively speculative reading of Oedipus, which is less about the play itself and more about an archaizing of origins in a domain that ends up being quite outside of tragedy itself, that is philosophy. That all being said, I think Goux is onto something here when he emphasizes the encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx as one of religious initiation, and that the way that Goux connects Greek religion, philosophy, and literature is deeply fascinating. Why do I think Goux is onto something here? Well, because it happened to me. Over 20 years ago now, as an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia, reading all this material, as well as Greek poetry, philosophy, and modern European literature, such as the early English mystery plays, Shakespeare, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Rilke, many others, I found myself at a festival on the summer solstice on Vancouver Island, suitably titled Dionysius, where everything that I was studying seemed to click together into what I can only describe as a magical initiatory event. Maybe it was all the yoga, maybe it was the setting surrounded by old-growth trees in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, or maybe it was the hefty dose of chocolate magic mushrooms. But the events that transpired that evening and through the night left me at least in no doubt that what is at the core of Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx is what Goux calls a telestics, that is a ritual initiation into the presencing of the gods, and what the Greeks called the mysteries. To make a long story short, after being possessed by a Grecian muse from the other side of the river, I began to sing in the rest of the night in iambic pentameter, and encountered many spiritual, although some would say psychological forces, which I can only describe as the ritual initiations of various Greek gods. Among them, Dionysus, Hermes, and Apollo, as well as Zeus and Hera. During one sequence in this episodic initiatory narrative, a Sphinx literally materialized before me and silently posed to me her riddle. To which I, like Oedipus, continuing to sing, confidently answered man, and sang something equivalent to the Sophoclean hymn to man we'll encounter in the second choral ode of the Antigone next week, only much more uncanny. I realized at the time, however, that I had not so much solved the riddle of the Sphinx, its answer being a foregone conclusion. And as impressive as my performance was before a literal hallucinatory Sphinx, the awe and terror I experienced were so intense that any answer, or a way of navigating that situation I might have undertaken, would have been insufficient. The Sphinx did not so much consider me to have passed her test, as she simply disappeared, almost taking the sacred presencing of the gods I was experiencing along with her. After this experience, which took me a long time to integrate, and of which the encounter with the Sphinx was just one episode, I was left in a somewhat unique position while reading Goux for the first time, to be able to agree with his emphasis on this episode with some degree of experience. The Sphinx, who at once represents the beauty of Apollo and the gore of Dionysus, the Iranian and the Chthonic, is an ineluctable horizon for our cultural and spiritual self-understanding. So that being my aside and confession about my hermeneutic situation and why it makes Goux's book attractive to me despite its flaws, let's turn now to his most anthropological chapter, The Rite of the Sphinx, where he begins by mentioning how scholars have shown that there are no major differences in terms of symbolics involved between the initiation rites of puberty, heroic royal initiation rites, and initiations into sacred mysteries. The central phase, the deepest core of every initiation, is constituted by the rite that provides a pathetic symbolization of the neophyte's death, a return to chaos or to hell, to the bowels of the earth, the primordial womb, and so on, followed after a period of uncertainty and mourning by the initiate's return among the living, as in a second birth. In varied forms, the themes of separation, descent into the world of the dead, or regression back to the womb, bloody trial, provisional death, reception of a secret teaching, renaissance, and resurrection can always be found. And Goux next turns to the evidence regarding the role of the Sphinx in such initiatory ceremony. Writing in light of the ethnological evidence, it is virtually certain that the Sphinx belongs to the category of teranthropomorphic beings, that is, combinations of human and animal forms that regularly come forward in liminal ritual situations on the threshold of the trial. Scholars have occasionally insisted on the pedagogical function of these monsters. They shatter the initiate's conformist and secular worldview, free him from the trivialities of daily life, and also frighten and disorient him so as to manifest the anguishing power of the sacred. These divinities, masters of initiation, are the ones who mutilate, devour, or kill the novice. The dismemberment of the boy's body, which is supposed to be eaten raw, follows the model of the death of the young Dionysus, dismembered by the Titans, and is part of the Dionysiac rites. Goux doesn't mention it here, but these are the specifically Orphic Dionysian rites, which you can follow along in my Dionysus lecture and Orpheus lectures in the classical mythology course. For a point of reference in comparison to the Sphinx in Sophocles, Goux cites Euripides' Sphinx. You came, you winged thing, earth's offspring, monster's child, to seize the sons of Cadmus. Half a maiden, a fearful beast, with roving wings and claws that fed on blood. You who snatched the youths from Dirce's plain, crying your fury's shriek, the song that knows no music. You brought sorrows upon our land, bloody ones, and bloody was the god who brought these things about. Mournings of the mothers, mournings of the maidens, filled our homes with grief. Groan and cry ran back and forth from one to another through the town, and thunder groaned as they did each time the winged bird seized one of the city's men. This passage is relevant to Goux's anthropological interpretation in terms of initiation rites for a number of reasons, but most essentially it focuses on the youths undergoing a terrible initiation akin to death, if not literal death, and the mournings of the mothers and the maidens who, in traditional societies that practice initiation rites, invariably behave precisely this way when the fathers or the elders drag off the young men to be initiated. Notice also the mention of the house of Cadmus, that is Oedipus's great-great-great-grandfather. As Goux notes, the Greeks were inclined to attribute an Egyptian origin, often erroneously, to whatever struck them as archaic and mysterious. Thus, legend frequently credits ancient Egypt, land of tombs and sphinxes, with the earliest initiations, and according to one legend, it was Cadmus who brought these initiatory practices from Egypt. And in fact, Sophocles places the emphasis on this founding ancestor of Thebes from the very first words of his play. We perhaps get a little insight into lost Theban Sphinx mythology in the much later writer Hyginus in the 3rd century CE. Hyginus tells us the Sphinx was an offspring of Typhon, king of the monsters, and was sent into Boeotia, where she lay waste the fields of the Thebans. Here it is Creon to whom she proposes her contest. If anyone interprets the riddle which she gave, she would depart, but that she would destroy whoever failed and under no circumstance leave the country. When Creon heard this, he made the proclamation throughout Greece and promised that he would give the kingdom and his sister Jocasta in marriage to anyone solving the riddle of the Sphinx. Many came out of greed for the kingdom and were devoured, but Oedipus, son of Laius, came and interpreted the riddle, and the Sphinx leaped to her death. Next, Goux is going to attempt to situate the role of the Sphinx in the Dionysiac theater on the basis of mostly vase painting evidence. And so he begins by a review of the Dionysiac ritual origin hypothesis. We know that in the earliest stage, theatrical spectacles consisted of a tetralogy that included 3 tragedies and a satiric drama. This arrangement faithfully repeated the unfolding of the mythico-ritual scenario of Dionysiac initiation. While this way of understanding every tetralogy of Greek tragedy has often been rightly questioned, the idea here is that as an act of worship of the god Dionysus, a trilogy's 3 parts would generally break down into 1. The struggles and sufferings of the god, 2. His bodily dismemberment, 3. The mourning laments that accompany his death, and 4. The satyr play that corresponds to the joy and hilarity that greet his rebirth. We simply don't have enough surviving trilogies to find any that directly instantiate this structure, but it's possible, if not probable, that Aeschylus's and Euripides' Theban sagas and most treatments of the Prometheus material correspond at least loosely to this pattern. Goux goes on to forge a link between the satyr play and the deliverance of the goddess Persephone in the Eleusinian mysteries. This ultimate phase, the satyr play, brazen and explosive, corresponds to the final phase of initiation in the heroic monomyth, namely marriage. And here we find the well-attested connection between the intervention of the Dionysiac troupe of satyrs and the emergence of the young girl, the ascent Anodos of the Chora, another name for Persephone, meaning maiden. The young girl leaves the infernal regions to emerge from the earth, which can then recover its springtime vegetation, its fertility. Goux next asks, what is the connection between the dog, who speaks in riddles, the Sphinx sometimes being figured with a dog's rather than a lion's body, and the young god of resurrecting drunkenness? What is the connection between the Sphinx and Dionysus? This has been a thorny problem in classical scholarship, and we won't go over all the more recent treatments and evidence here, and Goux is certainly not up to date in merely quoting from the Cambridge Ritual School and Jane Harrison on these points. Nevertheless, the specific piece of evidence he adduces for the connection of Dionysus and the Sphinx may be definitive. Goux looks to the Vagnonville Bowl, where we find a Sphinx who is seated atop a tumulus that is being attacked with picks by 2 satyrs. The sepulchral, that is funerary, character of the mound is beyond question. Something is buried here related to the cult of the dead and the ancestors. This bowl, mentioned by Jane Harrison, is not the only one of its type. A black, red-figured bowl painted by Meissen also shows 2 sphinxes destroying a tomb with picks, and a sphinx is seated atop the tumulus. From the earth through the tomb, the head and the shoulders of a young girl arise. And so what we see in these virtually canonical images is the ascent, or Anodos, of the Chora. Her emergence is greeted by the ecstatic dance of goat-footed pans and horse-tailed satyrs. Dionysus himself, with his thyrsus, awaits the moment of breakthrough, and a winged Eros is sometimes represented. Indeed, it is not too difficult to show that the goddess Persephone and the god Dionysus are closely connected in mystery initiation ritual, not only at Eleusis, but also in Orphism, where Persephone and Dionysus are the 2 gods who are ritually closest to humans, the savior gods of humanity and the human soul. In other words, by drawing a link between the god Dionysus, the queen of the underworld, Persephone, and the Sphinx who sits atop a tumulus surrounded by Dionysiac satyrs, we have drawn closer to a possible ritual ground underlying the performance of Greek tragedy. However, much Greek tragedy became an aesthetic phenomena only loosely connected to its religious roots. Goux returns to explaining how Oedipus's mythic anomaly can be understood in terms of these initiatory scenes. In the Oedipus story, the protagonist uses unconventional means to triumph over the Sphinx. He does not liberate the young girl who is kept inside a tomb by the monster. For the Sphinx to be truly vanquished, the intervention of Dionysus is required. The hubris of an autonomous Apollonian reflection, like the one Oedipus displays, does not suffice for genuine initiation. If the Sphinx was originally intended to be positioned on top of a tumulus, the tomb of a Chora, to be delivered from the power of Hades, we can understand why representations of Oedipus before the Sphinx constantly depict her seated on an artificial support, a sort of pedestal or column, rather than a rock. In certain representations, the column is particularly large, evoking a burial monument. It may be that the Sphinx is a guardian of tombs in some general way, and that she is used in this sense as a figure of sepulchral ornamentation. But when the tomb in question is one that satyrs are about to break open, we can only conclude that the motif of rebirth is involved. And the resemblance with Korah's ascent is so striking that we need hardly hesitate to see these representations as depicting the emergence into daylight of the girl delivered from the kingdom of the dead and promised to a fruitful coupling by the joyous announcers of spring's renewal and the return of sexual fervor. If we understand the Sphinx in this way and admit sepulchral connection in her representation and cult, then the Sphinx becomes a symbol of, quote, of the resurrection of the soul, for she often figures at the liminal threshold of real death and initiatory death. Goux can find a little more evidence for this when he looks to statuary and funerary bas-reliefs, where the Sphinx is often shown with a paw posed on the severed head of the deceased, implying that she is the animal that seizes the dead person's soul to drag it off to Hades. By decapitation and the imposition of the clawed foot, the Sphinx offers the deceased the promise of immortality and perhaps guarantees his survival in the next world. And so for Goux, the symbol of the Sphinx refers to the notion that death is rebirth and a supreme rite of passage. To die is to be initiated, as the Greek adage from Socrates goes. If we conceive of dying as crossing an initiatory threshold, that is, as a violent separation from the secular world, followed by rebirth on another ontological level, this is to express confidence in the soul's survival. Now, while I think these are all fair ways of understanding Sphinx imagery and symbolism that has come down to us, these are part of the most unclear parts of Goux's book, where he's stretching perhaps a bit beyond his own expertise. And this is why I'd like to cover now Renger's chapter on Oedipus before the Sphinx, in order to arrive at what are perhaps more generally well-accepted interpretations of this initiatory encounter. Renger begins by noting how extremely popular images of Oedipus and the Sphinx were, especially on Greek pottery. Of the roughly 100 images of the hero that are known to us, over 70% feature this scene, and roughly 40% come from the 5th century BCE, that is the time immediately preceding Sophocles' writing of Oedipus the king. Although occasionally sitting, Oedipus mostly stands, pondering before the Sphinx, who sits across from him atop columns or pillars, sometimes on altar-like shapes of varying heights or up on rocks. He always looks her in the eyes, whether she finds himself at her eye level, whether he is higher than her, or she is higher than him. The frontal gaze is significant and deserves special attention, for it is through this frontality that Oedipus determines his position with regards to the inhuman and the superhuman, the monster and the god. The vast majority of images do not suggest physical or armed violence. Renger indirectly would agree with Goux that Oedipus's posture or gesture reflects a development of a modern myth of intelligence, modern to the classical Greeks anyway, which is opposed to older conceptions of might and impotence. Again, indirectly agreeing with Goux, who she does not cite, Oedipus is not the physically superior warrior, but an astute man who achieves victory by unwearying intelligence. The Sphinx as well has a long afterlife in Western literature, esotericism, and philosophy. Since the encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx is not developed in our surviving sources, this is a lacunae or gap which later authors are free to fill out, which is what Jean Cocteau does in the 20th century when he writes his play The Infernal Machine, which you can listen to in the modules for this week, and which feature a more extended conversation of Oedipus and the Sphinx. For the Roman Seneca, according to Renger, the Sphinx represents the breakdown of the distinction between the world of the living and the world of the dead, again lending some support to Goux's theses. Seneca's Sphinx is ghastly and grotesque, a dreadful and nightmarish monstrum who impatiently slavers for Oedipus's entrails as she claws the rocks and knocks off the debris. Well-versed in modern mythography, the much later Cocteau knew exactly how to fill this space in a way far more exhaustive than Seneca's attempts. Cocteau's achievement, according to Renger, is to have singled out the Sphinx episode from among all the Theban narratives surrounding Oedipus, and to have used it to fill the dramatic gap that Sophocles left empty. For Renger, the difference between the Egyptian Sphinx and the Greek Sphinx comes down to this, quote, "By the time of its incorporation into Theban legends, the numinous protector of sanctuaries was transformed into a being reputed to perpetrate bloody terror, thus posing a threat to the social order. And thus, the Theban Sphinx was, in the Greek imagination, not a numinous guardian per se, but whose appearance in a bodily form represented the very threat to be avoided, the possible dangers of the threshold that anyone moving from one side or state to another had to pass through. And this is why the Sphinx often guards the territory or zone of a funerary mound, or the border between the outside and inside of a city or a palace. Although now, instead of mediating these dangers for the person passing over, the Sphinx is now the danger, consecrated in a single monstrous body. Whoever encountered the Sphinx was confronted with the monstrous embodiment of the threshold's negative aspects, the potential dangers that threatened everyone who made the passage. And so in Greece, according to Renger, the Sphinx becomes the other and the double of the self. A shadow beast who reflects the social negative which must be exorcised, and the negative in the self which must be overcome in order to endure the passage. Accomplishing this triumph over the liminal being, even if only apparently, is what makes Oedipus the repairer of order, the man of a valiant civic spirit, and someone worthy of the Theban throne. Again, Renger's use of the word apparently here shows a basic agreement with Goux. A human-headed lion, but later a 100-headed dog or bitch or man-devouring care in Aeschylus, the Sphinx is always at the same time a divine being with a superior status and special power from the gods. Diodorus Siculus calls her the double-formed monster, but she is also triple-formed. Renger goes further into her origins via Minoan Crete from Egypt, and notes how her image underwent several transformations, not to be found in Egyptian iconography. 1, the Greek Sphinx is the harbinger of death and its witness, and 2, she acquires her female gender rather than male. Through these two innovations, the Greek Sphinx ceases to be an image of mysterious sovereign power in the order of nature and becomes a scandal in the order of things, a disintegrating liminal monster. And so for the Greeks, her mythic genealogy becomes as various and as liminal as the Sphinx herself. Sometimes she is the daughter of Echidna, the snake woman, and Typhon, the king of the monsters, or in Hesiod, she's the daughter of Echidna or Chimera and Orthos, a two-headed dog. Either way, she's a product of incest, either mother-son or brother-sister, and in this way is the perfect monster to move aside so as to allow Oedipus to assume the throne and marry his own mother. In all her representations, the Sphinx is a chthonic beast of the soil, dark, dank, and subterranean, associated with Echidna, the snake woman or mother of monsters, the underworld, Earth's primal violence, the witch or fertility goddess Hecate, Cerberus, and the house of Hades. Her chthonic nature is opposed to Iranian religion, that is, to Zeus's light-filled dominion over a well-ordered universe. All these intense misogynistic genderings of the Sphinx in Greek thought also make her a very interesting figure for re-envisioning in literature in our contemporary era. I highly recommend Anne Goretta's novel The Sphinx, which is the first novel to not use any gendered pronouns, an innovation which points to the Sphinx's own ambiguous or liminal gender identity, sometimes male, sometimes female. The Sphinx is also an image of gender liminality. At Thebes, she becomes associated with her elevated place in the mountains as the mountain monster in Euripides, and this implies a spatial and existential challenge posed to the city from the wilderness. Sometimes the Sphinx is located in the Kythara Mountains or the Phykion Mountains, where his original name is Phix. According to one variant in the tradition, the Sphinx posed her riddle to every traveler who passed her on the mountain on the way to or from Thebes. And according to another, later tradition, she herself came daily to the marketplace of the city, to the Agora, so as to harvest her new victims there. Upon the mountains, she is said to have devoured all those who failed to solve her riddle, wantonly grabbing one of the citizens and whisking him through the air. This zonal threat continued unchecked until her encounter with Oedipus, who stared down her menace and dread and solved her riddle and brought her exploits to an end. And it is thus that Oedipus may figure in Sophocles' own consciousness as a figure of the Athenian Enlightenment over and against the terror of primeval mysteries. And here we'll go on a little excursus through Willis Goth Regier's book, The Book of the Sphinx, which begins with Sir Francis Bacon, who advised nobility to approach the Sphinx as Prince Oedipus did, slowly. Any all-aspiring know-it-all must study sphinxes, And the first Sphinx scholar, we could say, is Athanasius Kircher, the late Renaissance or early Baroque scholar, who was a curious man with a sunny disposition. 3 popes valued Kircher as a universal genius, an opinion he repaid with grandly illustrated treatises on music and magnetism, a proposal for a global language, vistas of the stars and the underground, and an introduction to China. He adored the Virgin, loved languages, athletics, and machinery, and in his prime he gave the Holy Roman Empire the book Oedipus Egyptiacus, a 4-part compendium of all that was known at that time anyway about Egypt and then some. By strenuous effort and miracle, Kircher deciphered Egypt's hieroglyphs, mostly correctly for later Egyptologists, but not without significant progress. And in a short reprise, he published Sphinx Mystagoga, his guide to the Sphinx. According to Renger, the Sphinx has always attracted thinkers of big thoughts like Augustus, Napoleon, and Hegel. In his 1820s aesthetics lecture, Hegel proposed the Sphinx as what he calls the symbol of the symbolic itself. What an idea, the symbol of the symbolic. How rhetorical, how Greek was Hegel's Sphinx. For the Sphinx synthesizes many other symbols, if not all symbols, private and public, sacred and recycled, the sticky charnel of history, and the spun sugar of fantasy. Goethe's Sphinx says, "We Sphinxes sit before the pyramids and judge the nations." In fact, when we widen our view of Sphinxes beyond the Greek cultural landscape, we find that there are Sphinxes of Isis, Sphinxes for Christ, Sphinxes of heights and abysses, Sphinxes in ranks, rows, and pairs, but 2 Sphinxes rise above the rest. In Egypt, we find the great Sphinx of Giza, flat on its belly amid ghosts of the gods, and he has a very old name, Horameket, sun on the horizon. This is much in contrast to the Greek Sphinx, whose original name is thought to be Phix, the riddler, the singer, the strangler, staring down into the brink of incoherence. Given how popular and widespread Sphinx lore was in the 5th to 4th century BC and throughout Hellenistic and Roman antiquity, we must ask, where have all the Sphinx gone? Indeed, their role in Greek mythology as a whole is often described in marginal ways. Giovanni Boccaccio, Thomas Bulfinch, and Edith Hamilton finish off the Sphinx in a paragraph or less, and Sophocles, at least in the works that have survived, barely sketches her. Before their extinction, Goethe's Sphinxes say Hercules killed the last of them. Sphinxes ranged across Anatolia, Thrace, the Peloponnesus, Crete, the Cyclades, Italy, Sardinia, and Spain. Like Sphinxes of Egypt and the Levant, they often appeared in couples besides gates and doorways, and took shape in pottery, jewelry, coins, and carvings. Sphinxes are not only of Egyptian and Greek origin, but also from the Levant, and they figure prominently in the Old Testament as cherubims. Sphinxes and cherubims are the thrones of God, associated with the sun, and they are given the task of guarding sacred spaces. After studying Sphinxes on 3 continents, André Dessine decided that the biblical cherubim were probably only Sphinxes. Since then, archaeologists have unearthed Sphinxes in Israel, and the Newell collection of ancient seals includes a hematite seal on which 2 seated winged sphinxes face each other with a sacred tree between them. We know from Genesis 3:24 that it is cherubim who guarded the Garden of Eden after the exile of Adam and Eve. So if cherubim are sphinxes, it's actually sphinxes who still protect the entry to the garden. If Albright, Demisch, and Dessen are right, there are sphinxes throughout the Bible, their role often being that of protecting the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. For example, in Exodus, the Lord commands Moses to make 2 cherubim of gold to cover the Ark of the Covenant with their outspread wings. A Psalm of David describes the Lord enthroned on cherubim. Cherubim are among the army of angels, the angels of governance in Enoch. And in a Midrash, Shemot Rabbah describes the cherubim as angels of destruction. By the time of Hegel's Sphinx, who we'll be getting closely into with Goux next week, Western consciousness begins to reflect on the encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx and to elevate a combined Egyptian and Greek Sphinx into what Renger here calls the Sphinx of Sphinxes, a mix of Phix and Hormaket and the Sphinxes of Luxor. Hegel's Sphinx is a species of idea, a fantastic body and a dazzling mind, a Sphinx with a history, an anatomy, a line of descent, and an arrested evolution. By the time it reached Hegel, the Sphinx, the symbol of symbols, had become deceptive, and Hegel's Sphinx is a symbol of the defeat of the Sphinx. In Answering Man, Oedipus asserts his self-consciousness and clarity and light over and against the chthonic, the disturbing, and the dark old religious powers. He thus comes to symbolize, in Hegel's philosophy, the evolution of self-consciousness out of the night of the unconscious. And so Hegel's Sphinx commemorates historically the overthrow of Egypt by Greece and the overthrow of enigma by thought, of nature by man, and of mystery by clarity. Hegel's Sphinx, in other words, loses. But Hegel died, and his symbol of symbols revived, returning in the late 19th and 20th centuries as advertisement for makeup and cigarettes. A sphinxy smile with fangs behind it, with sweet and epidemic charm. Indeed, we could say the Sphinx stepped out of Hegel's interpretation and vindicated his high regard, his symbol of symbols, symbolizing almost anything and yet specializing extensively. Here are some of the Sphinx's specializations, which Renger helpfully coalesces into a kind of alphabet or bestiary and provides an explanation of each entry, which we won't go into here. Take a minute to take all these in. The Sphinx also makes a stunning comeback in Romanticism, first in German and then in British Romanticism. In his novel Henry von Ofterdingen, Novalis has the Sphinx ask Fable a series of questions. Do you know me? Fable said, not yet. Where is love? Fable answers, in the imagination. So the Sphinx let her pass. Who knows the world? Asks the Sphinx. He who knows himself, Fable answered. And what is the eternal mystery? Love, Fable said, and stepped past the satisfied Sphinx, who was curled up to nap. What a much more charming encounter with the Sphinx than Oedipus's. At the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche asks us a critical question. Who here is Oedipus, and who the Sphinx? To answer this question and further explore this scene, let's review Goux's main theses in a nutshell. The Sphinx, as we've seen, is a severer of heads, and this phenomena deserves to be pondered. It is by decapitating that she kills, so as to drag the soul into the other world. She tears off the head, the locus of human reason. Confronted with the divine Sphinx, man is obliged to renounce what has been his source of pride. She assures passage into an elsewhere that human intelligence cannot comprehend. She allows man to cross the great threshold that separates life from death and that surpasses his comprehension. Hence the riddle, which is a trial that involves the head and requires its sacrifice. But the sacrifice of the head is precisely the one that Oedipus is unwilling to make. He reasons, he reflects, he refuses to allow himself to be robbed of his thinking ability, refuses to give up his power of reason. Oedipus philosophizes. While this may be a bit of a stretch, it's true that Oedipus does not want to lose his head. Weak-footed, Oedipus is strong-minded. He is not intimidated by the Sphinx's insidious question, for to him her enigmatic profundity, the secret hiding places of meaning, the rich obscurity of hidden revelations, of the initiatory arcanum, the cryptophoric symbol, in a word, is all superstition. No dimension of meaning can resist clarification, no riddle can be divine, no enigma can transcend the reflection of which a human head is capable. Keeping his wits about him, holding his head up, trusting in his own intelligence, denying the unknown, Oedipus affirms the autonomy and self-sufficiency of his own human reason. Thus tying up his encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx, Goux turns in chapter 4, the triple trial, to the theme of the functional tripartition, augmenting it now with Ludwig Leisner's book on the riddle of the Sphinx, who pointed out well over a century ago that mythical or legendary demons tend to impose three types of trials on their victims: trial by caress, trial by blow, and trial by question. These clearly correspond to the three functional domains: caresses mapping on to agricultural or sexual fertility, blows to war and the martial function, and questions to the sacred. The first trial concerns sexual desire, the second physical strength, and the third intelligence. Recall that the Sphinx, as the myth tells us, consists of three components: the head of a woman, the body of a lion, or sometimes dog, and the wings of an eagle. For Goux, these are clearly connected with Dumézil's three functions. The woman is the seductive component corresponding to the sexual trial that is characteristic of the third function, fertility. The lion's body is related to the values of the warrior-like strength proper to the second function, war. As for the eagle's wings, through their affinity with the heavens and the animal associated with Zeus, they constitute a no less clear symbol of the first function, the sacred. And so rather than allowing the Sphinx to symbolize more or less everything while specializing, or to be the symbol of symbols, as in Hegel, Goux brings the symbolism of the Sphinx back to a very distinctive pattern of thought in the archaic consciousness, in the archaic world, the trifunctional partition, and its latent mythology of initiatory or telestic investiture, the basic experience of the Greek gods and the mysteries. The basic problem of Oedipus is that he fails all three trials. Because of his excessive reflective intelligence that claims to evacuate without remainder the mystery of the Sphinx, the sacred function, he does not understand the sacred and falls into two other functional crimes: the marriage with the mother, a sexual crime, and the murder of the father, a martial crime. His mythic drama is thus defined by Goux as a myth of failed royal initiation. Again, in order to explore this a bit more clearly in terms of more recent scholarship, we can turn here to the chapter by Almut-Barbara Renger on Oedipus as a threshold myth. For Renger, the Oedipus myth, and especially the encounter with the Sphinx, has always been a site of intertextual and intercultural relations. While our modern subjectivity defines itself against the bestial or the immoral, when we look at the figure of Oedipus in myth and in Sophocles' drama, it veers towards the Sphinx, where this moment of encounter with the Sphinx involves liminality, uncertainty, and ambiguity. The Sphinx is the significant threshold phase, which sunders Oedipus's past and closes off his future from view. And the myth ends with Oedipus accepting what is irresolvably liminal within himself, becoming a wanderer until his death at Colonus. In his seminal article, Ambiguity and Reversal, French scholar Jean-Pierre Vernant underlines that Oedipus is recognizably a creature struck from the same mold as the ambiguous Sphinx herself. Just as the Sphinx is an extraordinary godliness and a monstrous nemesis at the same time, so too is Oedipus. Renger is now going to focus on how three key concepts interface in the encounter with the Sphinx, those of zone, threshold, and transition, and how the Sphinx constitutes both the outside the city of Thebes, and inside of Oedipus's own heroic trajectory. First of all, the Sphinx episode serves as a transition between the events that take place narratively and topographically outside Thebes, such as Oedipus's exposure as an infant up through the first broken taboo, the murder of the father, and the events that take place inside Thebes, his marriage to his mother, the second broken taboo, up through to his final renunciation of Thebes as a grown man, the moment of what could be called his re-exposure. The Sphinx episode is thus a linking joint in the narrative that mythographically generates an intervening space, a threshold or a zone. Even more than the oracles at Delphi, the Sphinx episode brings the first major segment of narrative events outside Thebes, the taboo of exposure and parricide, into a mirror image relationship with the second major segment, the second taboo, mother incest and Oedipus's re-exposure, without making the two parts identical. This all agrees with Goux, although is stated more concisely. And Renger provides us with a handy chart. Outside Thebes, Oedipus is exposed as a newborn, further events follow, and then the parricide, the first taboo. Then there's the threshold zone, the liminal space, wherein Oedipus confronts the Sphinx, followed by the events that happen inside Thebes, the mother incest, further events over several years, leading eventually to his re-exposure as a grown man. According to this framework, the Sphinx is neither outside nor inside, but in between, a scandalously liminal being perceived as a socially intolerable existence at the threshold. What the Sphinx's monstrous presence at the threshold makes clear is that she is a meta-figure for Oedipus's entire condition. Much like in Goux for Renger, externally, Oedipus performs his task with certain bravery and success, yet internally, the mission is incomplete. Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx is a symbol of failed initiation. And Renger goes on, although he moves past the Sphinx, victorious and therefore seemingly post-liminal, he is in fact perpetually liminal, in between, for internally he remains trapped within a threshold existence, outside the borders of the society in which he lives on account of his monstrous crimes. More precisely, this condition of perpetual liminality, symbolic anthropologist Victor Turner has famously called liminoid, and Turner contrasts liminal phenomena, where the neophyte or initiate undergoes a symbolic or transitional death at the threshold, but is eventually reunited with the community in a new social function, with what he calls liminoid phenomena, which are optional, a matter of individual choice rather than of collective rhythm, and in which there is no death and rebirth, but only a continued dwelling on the threshold, and a relying on human reason alone. Renger at this point turns explicitly to Victor Turner's work and its application to the myth of Oedipus, and this can help us flesh out the function that rites of passage and anthropology have in Goux' approach. Turner's work is very diverse, but he is most famous for his exploration and application of Arnold van Gennep's theory of rites of passage, such as birth, marriage, or death, which always consist, for van Gennep and Turner, of three phases: a preliminal phase, separation, a liminal phase, transition, and a postliminal phase, which Turner calls incorporation. Separation involves detachment from an individual or group and from an earlier fixed state in the social structure. During the margin, limen, or liminal period, the ritual subject is ambiguous, as Oedipus is in his threshold encounter with the Sphinx. Limen is here the Latin word for threshold, and when you are at a threshold, ambiguously between two states of ritual subjectivity in the social body, you are, in Turner's famous phrase, betwixt and between. The initiation or ritual can be considered successful when the passage is consummated, and this is the phase of aggregation, which leads to the postliminal phase as an incorporation or new birth. Now, Turner's analysis of ritual subjects in the liminal period corresponds pretty well to Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx. Ritual subjects are at once no longer classified and not yet classified. Oedipus's conscious or supraliminal mind refuses to heed or listen to the unconscious or subliminal warning that the Sphinx represents. A similar situation is presented in his road rage and murdering of his father, the crossroads. Unconsciously, having just heard the oracle of Apollo that he's destined to slay his father, you'd think that Oedipus would be wary to murder older men who resemble him. But the unconscious recognition of his father is repressed, or more precisely, his conscious intelligence is overridden by the passionate rage of his unconscious. Now, in the encounter with the Sphinx, the stakes are even higher, and he lets his conscious or supraliminal mind override the warning that the Sphinx represents. The result is his accession to the throne of Thebes and marriage with his mother. Now, it could be that in dramatizing the distinction of liminal transition and telestic fulfillment with that of liminal failure and the return to his mother, that the art form, which is Sophocles' drama, is already staging something a bit similar to Turner's distinction of obligation versus optation. Oedipus relies on himself alone, on his wits, on his ego, and refuses to heed the sacred obligation he has to the gods, even when he hears it from the mouths of a prophet like Tiresias. According to Turner, a feature of ritual in tribal, small-scale societies is that sooner or later no one is exempt from ritual duty. However, in modern industrial and post-industrial societies, rituals tend to be symbolic genres, associated with leisure, entertainment, or instruction, and so are optional or optational. This actually might be helpful in the way we understand Greek tragedy and how it is performed. Although it comes under the sign of Dionysus and is an act of worship in a Dionysian festival, it is also a work of art in which rituals are cited and imitated rather than explicitly or strictly performed. It has the character of a literary or artistic world. And on this level, it's not surprising, a world where the aesthetic function in part engulfs and drives any religious or philosophical thoughts that may be evoked along the way. While still deeply imbricated in Greek religious culture and political culture, as political art, Greek tragedy basically fulfills Turner's definition of a leisure genre, a genre in which many things are permitted to be represented in a form of play, theater, that would not otherwise in real life be permitted. Greek tragedy is, stricto sensu, a cultural product of leisure, and Turner's examples are literature, theater, poetry, novel, ballet, film, sports, music, art, pop, and art, and as such are all marketable commodities. This process begins to a certain extent with the process of competitive prize-giving for the winners of tragedy in ancient Athens. Such genres are no longer strictly traditional religious initiations, but rather pseudo- or post-liminal genres. And this is why in Greek tragedy the rituals and myths have been aesthetically modernized. While still resembling traditional myths, there is a greater freedom to transform their traditional structure, usually an out or an alternative way of conceiving the outcome of a mythic narrative. And so while this split isn't complete, in Sophocles' time, we can see a separation between theater as play and choice or entertainment, which puts as center stage a figure of great personal will and power like Oedipus, and on the other hand, theater as a matter of deep seriousness and even dread, a function we can still witness in Aeschylus, Sophocles, and even Euripides. In this analysis, it may be that plays like Oedipus Rex and rationalism in Greek philosophy more generally inaugurate something like the modern attitude to art. For ancient Greek tragedy was indeed a liminoid cultural genre, both separate from and yet within a liminal rite of passage, that is, a Dionysian festivity. As Turner puts this, in high cultures or complex societies, of which classical Athens was certainly one, the liminoid is not only removed from the rite, but the ancient rite coexists with the liminal genre in which it is reflected upon, dismantled, or reformed. Even more clearly, we can use Turner's analysis in order to understand Oedipus himself as a liminal personae, even as a shaman. Recall how for Turner, the liminal phase or second phase of transition in any given rite of passage is defined as a time when the ritual subject or passenger is undergoing a crossing to a new social status. This applies to Oedipus as well, in the most general sense, since his encounter with the Sphinx is at the same time his passage to a new identity as the king of Thebes. But at the same time, Oedipus's destiny is recognizable in terms of what Turner calls the class of people in society known as liminal personae, or threshold people, as persons who elude or slip through the network of classifications that normally locate states and positions in a cultural space, in not truly being what he seems to be, and in the repression and return of the crimes which invalidate his rule of Thebes, Oedipus is one such liminal persona. Turner goes on to describe the nearness of the shaman, the diviner, the medium, or the priest, the liminality as such, that is to figures of death, being in the womb, invisibility, darkness, bisexuality, the wilderness, or the eclipse of the sun and moon. Such functions can qualify an individual as what Turner calls eufunctionally liminal for a society. This is exactly how Oedipus styles himself in the very opening speech in Sophocles' drama, where, taking on all these roles, he purports to be the one person who can divine the darkness which wants solving. And so the very opening of the play confirms in Turner's terms that Oedipus Rex is eufunctional, a liminal figure on the threshold between the worlds of the gods and humans, and responsible for re-establishing their smooth communication at the limits of the breakdown of society. Richard Schechner picks up this connection of Oedipus, liminal personae, and shamanism directly in his 2005 performance theory when he writes, quote, "King Oedipus is a shaman. His sacrifice cures Thebes, and his search, assisted by the townsfolk, is a paradigm of the shamanic quest. The story is overlaid with other things, but its roots go deep into pre-Aristotelian patterns of feeling and doing." So with that background on Victor Turner, on liminalities and thresholds, let's get back to Renger, who reminds us that the German word for threshold is Schwelle, which refers to the swollen part of the doorway. And we can recall here swollen foot in Greek, which in German would be threshold foot, Schwellenfuß. On the distinction between thresholds, which are liminal, and borders, which are not, Renger cites Walter Benjamin in the Arcades Project, quote, "The threshold, Schwelle, must be sharply distinguished from the border, Grenze. The threshold is a zone. Transformation, transition, and floods lie in the word swelling, and the etymology ought not to overlook these senses." And so for Renger, border versus threshold is a matter of fixed versus porous boundaries. Borders delimit zones, and thresholds cause them to communicate, although equivocally and ambiguously. And it is here that Renger introduces Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner on threshold beings and liminality, for Oedipus crosses many thresholds in his various rites of passage, from youth to manhood, from bachelorhood to marriage, from outsider to citizen, and from a stateless nobody to a king and hero. After reviewing the basics of van Gennep's theory of rites of passage, as we have done, and Turner's emphasis on the threshold phase as betwixt and between, Renger notes how van Gennep and Turner both speak of, quote, winged dragons, the Sphinx, and all sorts of monsters as the traditional guardians of the threshold. They are, quote, the living embodiments of threshold forces, and receptive to prayers and sacrifices. They safeguard the transition. Through their numinous presence, they push the earthly spatial dimension of the door and the threshold into the background, and they foreground the spookier, more abstract qualities of these liminal spaces. The hero and the monster are also doubles in Jean-Pierre Vernant, who we cited earlier on Oedipus himself as the Sphinx. Renger notes how the Sphinx, like other monsters in hero myth, is an existentially unstable mix of forms, a terrifying confusion that has to be overcome in order to establish or stabilize civilization and social order. And so in the encounter with the Sphinx, Oedipus both achieves and does not achieve a change in his state of being. He both escapes and does not escape from the Sphinx. Externally, it looks as if he has bested and transcended her and achieved dominion, although internally, his destiny remains seized by the Sphinx, and he is under her dominion. For Renger, Jean-Pierre Vernant again explains this best in his Ambiguity and Reversal. Oedipus is double. He is, in himself, a riddle whose meaning he can only guess when he discovers himself to be, in every respect, the opposite of what he thought he was and appeared to be. His solution to the Sphinx's riddle only propounds the ambiguity and reversal inherent in his destiny. The Sphinx's withdrawal being precisely Oedipus seized by the net of his destiny and entering into Thebes and his tragic fate. He eventually discovers he is not the man he thought he was, a noble and just king. The riddle solver is himself a riddle. The guarantor of justice is a deviant fiend. The seer of the light is blind. The savior of the city is a harbinger of its doom. And the patron of civil culture and society is profoundly unworthy of it. This recognition of Oedipus's destiny leads to the question of whether this god-king is also a scapegoat. For as Vernant points out, it is in the figure of the scapegoat, or pharmakos, that we often find the motif of the sacrifice of the king. Vernant thus posits the thesis that the fundamental ambiguity of Oedipus, with its many sub-ambiguities, encompasses the extremes of the god-king and of the scapegoat, and that these two extremes, when taken together, turn Oedipus into a riddle, a paradoxical formula with two meanings, divine king and pharmakos. These are the two sides to Oedipus that make a riddle of him by combining within him two figures, the one the reverse of the other. The first figure is as a divine king, savior of the city, restorer of its order through the conquest of the Sphinx, and bringer of salvation, and the other is filth, deformity, madness, and crime, the very malfunctioning of the social order he embodies. And hence Oedipus's unsurpassable ambiguity, noble king or pharmakos, leads to the tragic reversal, exile, blindness, and damnation. Getting even more precise, Renger speaks of two falls. First the Sphinx falls, then Oedipus. The fall of the one, the Sphinx who poses the riddle, sets the mysterious reversal dynamic on an irreversible path, running up to Oedipus's own fall at the tragedy's conclusion. Here, all positive values are now reversed into the negative. The hero solves the riddle of the Sphinx with his formidable intelligence, but not, however, the riddle of his own existence. That is to say, he clears the way for the very terror that brings death to the city. He does not, therefore, stave off the actual blight, but rather unwittingly enables the fulfillment of his own blighted fate. So here, as again in Goux, the fall of the Sphinx does not mark the ascent of the hero, but its opposite, at least eventually. And the city's acceptance of the formerly expelled hero initiates his re-exposure. In other words, Oedipus's triumph over the Sphinx actually marks the decisive onset of his own catastrophe, when he removes the very eyes with which he lost himself in his double's gaze. There will be none on earth transformed into a more unfortunate state. So what are our takeaways from this encounter of Oedipus and the Sphinx? We found how the story of the confrontation with the Sphinx can be read as the story of a man who refuses to engage his own liminality, both as an adolescent and as a king. Being stretched between birth and death, the horizon of liminality and the perpetual condition of limbo, of course, constitute basic parts of human life. For Renger, the constellation of Oedipus and the Sphinx is paradigmatic for the human condition. We may, on occasion, experience an initiation royale or accomplish a great feat of autonomous intelligence, but that is no guarantee that our destiny will be a happy one. We never know when we will be driven to the very limit, either saving ourselves or others, or realizing our condition of monstrousness, such as patricide, incest, the sub, or the inhuman. We are no longer what we were, and not yet what we will be. Like Oedipus, we tarry on the threshold, perpetually a liminal creature that must learn to submit to its own liminality. Renger thus crystallizes the Oedipus myth into a formula: no passage before the Sphinx, no catastrophe, no self-realization. This is the coda of Greek tragedy. And so, in the end, what Sophocles' versions strikingly and unforgettingly express is the limitation of an excessive faith in the human powers of understanding, where intellectual superiority is in no way able to preserve the hero against error, hubris, and blindness. That being the conclusion of this first of a three-part series, Oedipus and the Sphinx. Next time, we'll be returning to Jean-Joseph Goux' reading of the posture of Oedipus in the history of philosophy, as well as to other notable and influential philosophies of tragedy, in Friedrich Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy and in Heidegger's account of Sophocles and the figure of Oedipus. See you then, and have a good week.